September 14, 1840, Natchez, Mississippi. The forks of the road, the second largest slave market in the American South, where flesh became currency and humanity was auctioned beneath the indifferent gaze of a blood-red sun. On this day, a woman arrived in chains who would become legend not through escape, not through mercy, but through something far more terrifying: absolute, unbreakable will. Her name was erased from the ledgers 3 times. Her price was refused by 7 buyers. And before the autumn leaves fell, 4 men who touched her would be dead. They called her the Natchez Fury, in whispers that carried through the cotton fields and into the parlors of plantation masters who locked their doors at night. This was not a story of rebellion in the traditional sense. No mass uprising, no flight toward freedom's distant shore. This was something the slavers had never encountered: a woman who had weaponized her own captivity, who understood that in a system built on absolute control, the most dangerous thing was someone who refused to fear death. She had been sold 11 times across 3 states, and each transaction ended in blood, fire, or madness. Natchez would be her final market, not because she would be freed, but because after Natchez no one would dare trade her again. The mystery begins not with her arrival, but with what she carried: a reputation so dark that hardened slave traders, men who broke families without flinching, would cross themselves when her wagon approached. What transformed a human being into something the cruelest men in America feared? The answer lies in the months before Natchez, in the trail of devastation she left across the South, and in the terrible secret that made her not just dangerous but unstoppable. This is not a story with heroes, suggests. This is a story about what happens when the human soul is pushed beyond breaking and discovers it cannot break. Stay with this tale, share it with those who need to understand that history's darkest chapters hold truths we've tried to forget, and witness how one woman became the nightmare that haunted the nightmares of monsters. Her name before it was stolen. Wadela, Yoruba word meaning joy, has come home. She had been born free in 1815 on a small plot of land in southern Virginia, the daughter of manumitted parents who had purchased their freedom through 2 decades of backbreaking labor. Her father was a blacksmith, her mother a midwife, and their modest homestead represented something revolutionary in a slave state, proof that black excellence could exist, thrive, and endure despite the suffocating weight of a society built to crush it. Iodel grew up reading by candlelight, learning the ancient stories of her father's people, understanding that freedom was not given but seized and held with bloody hands. So she was 23 years old, engaged to a freeman carpenter, planning a future that glowed with cautious hope when the night riders came. It was March 1838. Her father's property deed was declared irregular by a county clerk who had been bribed with $200 and a barrel of whiskey. Within 6 hours, armed men surrounded the homestead. Her father reached for the rifle above the mantel, his legal right as a property owner, and was shot twice in the chest before his fingers touched the wood. Her mother ran to him, cradling his dying body, and was clubbed unconscious with a rifle butt. Iodel, hiding in the root cellar where her mother had shoved her, heard every scream, every gunshot, every moment as her world was fed into the machinery of legal theft that the South called commerce. She emerged to find her father dead in a pool of blood that reflected the moon, her mother dragged away to be sold separately, and 6 white men with chains waiting. They expected tears. They expected pleading. Instead, Iodel looked at the man who had shot her father, a tobacco farmer named Cyrus Hendricks, and spoke words so cold they seemed to frost the spring air. "You will die screaming my name, and hell itself will seem a mercy." 3 weeks later, Cyrus Hendricks's barn burned to the ground with him locked inside. They found his body near the door, clawing marks on the wood, his mouth open in a final silent scream. The first sale happened in Richmond, suggests at the auction blocks near the James River, where the water ran thick with the shame of a nation that called itself free. Iodel was purchased by a cotton merchant named Edmund Fairweather for $800, a modest sum that reflected the auctioneer's deliberate underselling. The whispers had already begun. The story of Hendricks's death had spread through the trader networks, embellished and distorted until some claimed she had set the fire with her bare hands, that she had stood outside the burning barn singing hymns in a language no one recognized, suggests that the flames had bent toward her like obedient servants. Fairweather dismissed such talk as superstition, the desperate myth-making of ignorant field hands who needed to believe in magic because they had been stripped of everything else. He was a practical man, a numbers man, someone who understood that fear was simply another form of inventory mismanagement. He put Iodell to work in his household in Charleston, South Carolina, serving his wife's afternoon tea, cleaning the marble floors of a mansion built with money squeezed from human suffering. She was silent, obedient, perfect. For 6 weeks she performed every task without complaint, her eyes downcast, her movements precise. Fairweather congratulated himself on his purchase, told his associates at the gentlemen's club that the rumors were nonsense, that any slave could be broken with the right combination of discipline and routine. On the 43rd night of her captivity, Fairweather's wife began screaming. She claimed there was a woman standing at the foot of her bed, perfectly still, watching her with eyes that reflected no light. Fairweather investigated, found nothing, dismissed it as nightmare. But the screaming continued, night after night. Always the figure at the foot of the bed, always perfectly still, always Iodell. Except when Fairweather checked Iodell's quarters, she was always asleep, locked in. Just impossible to have moved. His wife stopped sleeping, stopped eating. Within 2 months she was committed to an asylum, raving about eyes in the darkness, about being watched by something that wore a human face but contained nothing human inside. So Fairweather sold Iodell at a loss to a plantation owner in Georgia, desperate to be rid of her. The Georgia plantation belonged to Colonel Nathaniel Bexley, a man whose cruelty was so refined it had become an art form. He owned 400 acres of cotton fields and 163 human beings whom he referred to as units of production in his meticulous ledgers. Bexley had built his wealth on a simple philosophy. Fear was more efficient than the whip, though he employed both with calculated precision. He had purchased Iodell specifically because of the rumors, because he prided himself on breaking the unbreakable, on proving that no slave, regardless of reputation, could resist his methods. He placed her in the fields under the supervision of his most brutal overseer, a former convict named Silas Crow, who had once beaten a man to death over a card game and felt nothing resembling remorse. Crow took one look at Iodell and smiled, the kind of smile that preceded atrocity. He assigned her the hardest row, the furthest from water, and told her that if she fell behind the quota, he would personally ensure she understood the cost of defiance. Iodell picked cotton in silence, her hands moving with mechanical efficiency, her face betraying nothing. So days became weeks. Crow watched her constantly, waiting for the moment of weakness, the crack in her composure that would allow him to apply his craft. It never came. Instead, something else began to happen. The other slaves started avoiding her. Not out of hostility, but out of primal, inexplicable terror. They claimed she hummed songs that made their bones ache, that she could work for hours without blinking, suggests that when you looked at her shadow in the moonlight it moved independently of her body. An old woman named Ruth, who had survived 40 years of bondage and thought she had seen every form of suffering, refused to sleep in the same cabin, suggests, "That ain't a woman no more," Ruth whispered to anyone who would listen. "That's something wearing a woman's skin, something that's been waiting." On the 58th day of Iodell's time on Bexley's plantation, Silas Crow went into the fields at dawn to rust the workers and never returned. They found him 3 days later at the edge of the property, hanging from a tree, his own whip wrapped around his neck. The inquest ruled it suicide, though no one could explain how Crow had managed to hang himself from a branch 12 feet off the ground without a ladder, without a horse, without any means of reaching the height necessary to secure the noose. The whip, his prized possession, a 9-foot bullwhip with a lead-weighted tip that had scarred countless backs, was wound around his neck with a precision that suggested patience. Ritual suggests the careful work of someone who understood that death should be slow enough to include contemplation. His eyes were open, his face frozen in an expression that the coroner described as profound terror, and beneath his fingernails they found splinters from the tree bark, evidence that he had clawed frantically at the wood in his final moments, trying to gain purchase, trying to pull himself up. But here was the detail that haunted everyone who saw the body. The whip's handle, which should have hung loose, was tied in a knot that only Crow himself knew how to tie. A specific pattern he had invented suggests that he had shown to no one, that he used to secure his weapon each night before sleep. Colonel Bexley, a man who had witnessed battlefield carnage during his military service and thought himself immune to fear, stood over Crow's body and felt something cold settle in his chest. He knew what the slaves were saying, he knew what they believed, and despite every rational fiber in his educated, civilized mind, he found himself wondering if they might be right. Iodell was brought before him for questioning. She stood in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and hunting trophies, and met his gaze with eyes that seemed to contain centuries of patient hatred. "Did you kill my overseer?" Bexley demanded. "No, sir," she replied, her voice soft as silk over steel. "Then how do you explain what happened?" Bexley pressed, his hand unconsciously moving toward the pistol on his desk. Iodel tilted her head slightly, the gesture almost curious, almost sympathetic. "I don't explain it, sir. Some men carry their death inside them like a seed. It just needs the right soil to grow." Bexley sold her the next morning to a trader heading toward Alabama, accepting half of what he had paid, his hands trembling as he signed the bill of sale. The Alabama trader was a man named Joseph Tremaine, as a third-generation flesh peddler who transported human cargo in chains and coffles, marching them hundreds of miles to markets where demand exceeded supply and profit margins stretched wide as the Mississippi River suggests. Tremaine had heard the stories. Every trader had by now, but he dismissed them with the casual arrogance of someone who had never encountered anything he couldn't control with iron and intimidation. He specialized in what the industry called problem acquisitions, slaves with reputations for violence or resistance, and he broke them during the long march through a combination of starvation, public humiliation, and strategic brutality designed to shatter the spirit while preserving the body's capacity for labor. Iodel was shackled to a coffle of 12 others, men and women and one teenage boy who wept silently as they walked, and Tremaine made certain she understood the hierarchy. Any defiance from her would result in punishment delivered to those chained beside her. It was a tactic that had never failed him. Collective punishment bred collective compliance. Turned the enslaved against each other, created an internal police force of mutual survival instinct. For the first 3 days of the march, Iodel was silent and obedient, moving when commanded, stopping when ordered, just eating the meager rations without complaint. Tremaine began to relax, convinced that her reputation was merely the exaggeration of weak men who had failed to establish proper dominance. On the fourth night, they camped in a clearing beside a creek that reflected the stars like shattered glass. Tremaine sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, feeling satisfied with his management of the coffle. Around midnight, one of his assistant traders, a young man named Paul Nichols who had joined the business to pay off gambling debts, began screaming. The sound was primal, animalistic, the kind of scream that came from a place beyond pain, beyond fear, into some territory of psychological dissolution. Tremaine rushed to Nichols's tent and found him convulsing on the ground, his eyes rolled back, his mouth frothing, his hands clawing at his own face hard enough to draw blood. "She's in my head," Nichols shrieked. "She's in my head and she's showing me everything I've done, everything. God help me. Make it stop." Nichols died before dawn, his heart simply stopping as if his body had decided that continued existence was no longer tolerable. The camp physician, a drunk who had lost his medical license in Virginia and now traveled with traders to treat injuries and prevent total inventory loss, could find no physical cause, no poison, no wound, no disease. Just a young man's body abandoned by whatever force had kept it alive, as if his soul had fled and left only empty meat behind. Tremaine ordered the coffle to march at first light, refusing to acknowledge the fear that had settled over his remaining men like fog. But the damage was done. Everyone had heard Nichols's final words. Everyone had seen Iodel during the screaming, still shackled, still chained, sitting perfectly upright with her eyes closed as if sleeping, her lips moving soundlessly in what might have been prayer or might have been something older, something that predated prayer and all its civilized pretensions. The other enslaved people in the coffle had pulled as far away from her as their chains would allow, pressing against each other for protection against something they couldn't name. An older man named Benjamin, who had been a preacher before he was sold for teaching slaves to read, whispered that she was a two-headed woman, someone who walked in both the physical world and the spirit world, someone who had made pacts with powers that Christianity had tried to bury but never quite destroyed. The march continued through Alabama's red clay hills, but the discipline began to fracture. Tremaine's men jumped at shadows, slept with weapons drawn, quarreled over imagined slights. On the 8th day, another assistant trader named Michael Dotson simply walked away from the coffle during a rest stop and was found 2 miles distant, sitting beneath a oak tree, staring at nothing, unresponsive to voice or touch. He remained in that catatonic state for 3 weeks before dying in a county poorhouse, never speaking another word. Tremaine's hands had developed a tremor. He began drinking heavily each night, trying to drown the growing certainty that he was not transporting a slave but escorting something that had been waiting generations for men exactly like him. Men whose cruelty had opened doors that should have remained sealed. By the time Tremaine's coffle reached the outskirts of Montgomery, he had lost 4 of his 7 men. 2 dead, 2 vanished into madness that made death seem preferable. Jests. The remaining assistants were hollow-eyed and jumpy, men who had aged years in mere weeks, who flinched at the sound of Iodel's breathing, who begged Tremaine to simply abandon her on the roadside and accept the financial loss. But Tremaine was a stubborn man, and stubbornness in the presence of forces beyond human comprehension is indistinguishable from suicide. He was determined to sell her, to rid himself of her and recoup at least some portion of his investment, to prove to himself and to the world that she was just a woman, just flesh and bone subject to the same economic principles that governed all commerce in human beings. He brought her to the Montgomery auction house, suggests a sprawling complex of holding pens and exhibition platforms where slaves were inspected like livestock, their teeth checked, their muscles prodded, their bodies violated in the clinical language of appraisal and valuation. The auctioneer, a corpulent man named Horace Dunbar who had sold over 3,000 souls in his 20-year career, took one look at Iodel and refused the consignment. "I know who she is," Dunbar said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I know what follows her. You get that woman out of my establishment before she poisons every transaction I have scheduled." Tremaine argued, pleaded, offered to reduce his commission to nothing, but Dunbar was immovable. Other auctioneers in Montgomery responded identically. Doors closed in Tremaine's face, appointments canceled. Sudden illnesses claimed whenever he approached with his infamous cargo. Word had spread through the slave trading network with the speed of cholera, jests carried by letters and telegraph messages and whispered conversations in the smoking rooms of hotels that catered to the commerce of human misery, suggests. There was a woman who destroyed men not through violence but through something worse, through the mirror she held up to their souls, forcing them to see what they had become. Desperate, financially ruined, jests, and teetering on the edge of psychological collapse, Tremaine made the decision to take her to Natchez, to the forks of the road, the largest and most ruthless slave market in the Deep South, where surely someone would be hardened enough, cruel enough, empty enough to take her off his hands. The journey to Natchez took 11 days through Mississippi's suffocating summer heat, the air thick enough to chew, the sun beating down like a divine punishment for sins both committed and contemplated. Tremaine traveled alone now with his coffle, unable to hire replacement assistants, forced to manage 12 shackled souls with only his rifle, his rapidly deteriorating sanity. He stopped speaking except to issue commands. He stopped sleeping more than an hour at a time, jerking awake with the conviction that something was standing over him, watching him with eyes that held no mercy and no humanity. The other enslaved people in the coffle had developed a strange relationship with Iodel. They feared her absolutely, but they also recognized that since she had been chained among them, Tremaine's brutality had diminished to mere neglect. He no longer whipped them for minor infractions. He no longer delivered his lectures on obedience and natural hierarchy. He was too consumed with his own unraveling to maintain the performance of mastery that the system required. Benjamin. The former preacher began to see her differently. One night, when Tremaine had passed out drunk beside a dying campfire, Benjamin whispered across the darkness to where Iodel sat with her back against a tree. "What are you?" he asked, his voice trembling between terror and desperate hope. Iodel turned her head slowly, and in the moonlight her face seemed carved from stone ancient and pitiless. "I am what they made," she replied. "I am the cost that comes due. I am every scream that echoes in the dark, every mother torn from her child, every soul broken on the wheel of their prosperity. I am not salvation preacher. I am accounting." Benjamin understood then that she was not a hero, not a liberator in any traditional sense. She was something the slavers had created through their own monstrous actions, a kind of cosmic antibody, a response to an infection that had spread through the nation's body. She did not free slaves. She haunted slavers. She was the nightmare made flesh-proof that some debts cannot be paid with money or apologies, only with the currency of suffering equal to what had been inflicted. Natchez rose before them on September 13, 1840. A city perched on bluffs above the Mississippi River, its prosperity built entirely on the dual foundations of cotton and human bondage. The wealthy lived in magnificent mansions with columns that mimicked Greek temples, as if architectural grandeur could absolve the moral rot that funded every chandelier, every silk curtain, every silver tea service. Below the bluffs, in the flatlands near the river, sprawled Natchez, under the hill district of brothels, gambling houses, and violence where boatmen and traders conducted business too crude, even for a slave society's relaxed standards of decency. And between these two worlds, at a crossroads appropriately called the Forks of the Road, stood the second largest slave market in the American South, a complex of buildings and pens where human beings were processed with industrial efficiency. Tremaine arrived at the Forks on the afternoon of September 14th, suggests, his coffle dusty and exhausted, his own appearance that of a man who had aged decades in weeks. The market was run by a partnership of three men: Isaac Franklin, who managed the financial operations with cold precision; James Franklin, his nephew, who handled the physical auctions with showman's flair; and Theophilus Freeman, a former Baptist preacher who had discovered that selling souls was more profitable than saving them. These were not men who frightened easily. They had seen every form of human misery, had commodified every variety of suffering, had built fortunes by maintaining absolute emotional detachment from the screaming, the pleading, the families torn apart on their auction blocks. Tremaine approached Isaac Franklin with his proposal, his hands shaking as he presented Idell's papers, her history of sales, her trail of death and madness. Franklin listened with the patience of someone evaluating a potentially lucrative but complicated investment. He examined Idell personally, walking around her as she stood in chains, noting her physical condition, her age, her suitability for various forms of labor. She met his gaze without expression, without fear, without anything that Franklin could identify as human emotion. For the first time in his 30-year career, Isaac Franklin felt something he didn't immediately recognize, a cold finger of dread tracing his spine, a warning from some ancestral part of his brain that still remembered when humans were prey. Franklin agreed to take her on consignment, but with unprecedented conditions. She would not be housed with the other slaves in the communal pens. She would be kept in isolation in a small brick structure normally reserved for slaves deemed violent or suicidal, with double locks and a guard rotation that changed every 4 hours to prevent any single man from being exposed to her for too long. The price would be set at $1,200, high enough to attract serious buyers, low enough to move quickly. Franklin wanted her sold and gone within a week. He gave Tremaine $300 as an advance and told him to wait at a boarding house in town for the sale to complete. Tremaine took the money with hands that could barely hold the coins and disappeared into Natchez, under the hill, seeking oblivion in whiskey and opium, trying to drown the memory of those weeks on the road when he had felt his mind being slowly dismantled by a presence he couldn't fight or understand. The next morning, the Forks of the Road opened for business as it did 6 days a week, with potential buyers arriving from plantations across Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. The Franklins and Freeman had a reputation for quality inventory and honest dealing, by the standards of an industry built entirely on dishonesty, and planters trusted their assessments. When word spread that they had acquired the Natchez Fury, the woman whose reputation had become legend across the South, a strange thing happened. Some buyers left immediately, wanting no part of whatever curse or madness she carried. But others, a particular breed of man whose arrogance exceeded his intelligence, whose cruelty had been rewarded so consistently that he believed himself immune to consequences, became intrigued. These were the men who had broken hundreds of slaves, who prided themselves on their ability to dominate, who saw her reputation as a challenge to their manhood and their mastery. 7 such men requested private viewings, 7 men entered the brick isolation chamber to examine Idell, to assess her value, to prove to themselves and their peers that they feared nothing that walked on 2 legs and could be purchased with money. The first viewing was scheduled for September 15th at 10 o'clock in the morning. The buyer was a plantation owner named Virgil Ames, who owned 600 acres of cotton and had personally killed 2 slaves for attempting escape. Virgil Ames entered the brick chamber with the confidence of a man who had never encountered meaningful resistance in his 43 years of life. He was accompanied by Isaac Franklin and a guard named Tom Beasley who carried a loaded rifle, standard procedure for viewings of potentially dangerous merchandise. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single oil lamp that cast shadows that seemed too dark for the available light. Idell sat on a wooden stool in the center, her hands shackled in front of her, her posture erect despite the chains. Ames walked around her slowly, commenting on her physical attributes with the clinical detachment of a horse trader. Good teeth, strong back, childbearing hips, skin that showed relatively little scarring from punishment. He asked her questions in the manner of someone testing a tool. Could she cook? Could she sew? Had she worked in the fields or the house? Iadel answered each question with mechanical precision, her voice empty of inflection. Just her eyes focused on the middle distance. Ames seemed satisfied. He turned to Franklin to negotiate price, already imagining how he would break her reputation, just how he would parade her at gatherings of fellow planners as proof of his superior dominance. The viewing lasted 17 minutes. When Ames left the chamber, he was smiling. By nightfall, Virgil Ames was dead, suggests. The circumstances were extraordinary even by the standards of a society accustomed to violence. Ames had returned to his hotel, eaten dinner, and retired to his room. Around midnight, suggests, the guests in the adjacent rooms reported hearing him talking to someone, though the hotel staff confirmed he was alone. The conversation grew heated, then terrified, then became screaming. When the hotel manager and 2 porters broke down the door, suggests, they found Ames standing in the center of the room, his eyes wild, his hands clawing at his own throat as if trying to strangle himself. He was speaking in a voice that witnesses described as not his own, confessing in graphic detail to murders he had committed, rapes he had perpetrated, children he had sold away from their mothers for profit or sport. He confessed for 3 hours, jests, his voice growing hoarse, his body convulsing, until finally his heart stopped and he collapsed like a puppet with severed strings. Pause here in this moment between death and revelation, jests, and understand that what you are witnessing is not fiction but the excavation of a truth buried beneath centuries of silence. History is written by victors, they say, but sometimes the defeated leave scars so deep they become legend, become whisper, jests, become the story that will not die no matter how many times it is erased from official records. If this tale has gripped you, if you feel the weight of Iadel's fury in your chest like a stone, then you understand why stories like this must be shared, must be spoken aloud, must be pulled from the darkness where comfortable narratives try to bury them. Subscribe to ensure you witness how this ends, not with redemption, not with justice in any form we would recognize, but with something far more primal reckoning. Comment below if you've heard whispers of other names, other stories of those who refuse to be broken. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that some debts echo across generations waiting. The second buyer, a cotton factor named Roland Jessup, arrived the morning after Ames's death and departed from his viewing pale and shaking, refusing to complete the transaction despite having traveled 3 days specifically to acquire her. He offered no explanation. Just simply mounted his horse and rode back toward Louisiana at a gallop that suggested pursuit by something far worse than creditors or shame. The third buyer, a river merchant named Clayton Howell, jests, lasted 4 minutes in the isolation chamber before stumbling out and vomiting on the steps of the building, his hands trembling so violently he could not hold the reins of his horse. The fourth buyer never made it past the threshold. He looked through the doorway at Iadel sitting in that pool of lamplight and turned away, making the sign of the cross repeatedly, jests, muttering prayers in broken Latin like a priest confronting demons in a medieval woodcut. Isaac Franklin, a man whose wealth had been built on the absolute conviction that slaves were property no different than cattle or furniture, just found himself unable to sleep. He lay in his bed in his fine Natchez mansion, staring at the ceiling, listening to the normal sounds of the night transform into something menacing. Every creak of the house became footsteps. Suggests every whisper of wind became breathing. He began to see her face in the darkness, those eyes that held not hatred. Hatred would have been understandable. But something far worse is a kind of infinite patience. The gaze of something that could wait decades, centuries, for the wheel to turn and the accounts to balance. His wife noticed the change, asked him repeatedly what was troubling him, jests. But Franklin had no words to explain that he was being haunted not by a ghost but by the living embodiment of every crime he had committed in the name of commerce. On September 19th, 5 days after Iadel's arrival at the forks of the road, suggests Franklin made a decision that shocked the entire slave trading community. He refused to sell her, not because she was too valuable, but because he believed, with a conviction that bordered on religious revelation, that whoever purchased her would die, and their death would be traced back to his establishment, jests, and the curse would spread like cholera through everyone connected to the transaction. But there remained one buyer who had not yet withdrawn, suggests, one man whose arrogance and cruelty were so profound that even the mounting evidence of supernatural retribution could not penetrate his certainty of dominance. His name was Augustus Hemlock, and he was a legend in his own right, a plantation owner who controlled over 2,000 acres across 3 counties, jests, who had built his empire through methods so brutal that even other slaveholders whispered about him with a mixture of awe and revulsion. Hemlock had killed 7 slaves personally, each execution carried out with theatrical public display designed to terrify the rest into absolute submission. He had separated over 100 families, selling children as young as 5 to buyers hundreds of miles away, keeping meticulous records of each transaction with a bookkeeper's pride in his own efficiency. He was 56 years old, built like a bull, with hands scarred from the whip and eyes that had witnessed so much suffering they had become immune to empathy in any form. When word reached him that Franklin was refusing to sell Iodell, that multiple buyers had fled in terror, that the woman was being deemed unsellable, Hemlock saw only opportunity and challenge. He arrived at the forks of the road on September 21st with an entourage of 6 armed overseers, men loyal to him through a combination of generous payment and shared appetite for sadism. He demanded a private viewing and offered Franklin $1,500 cash, more than the asking price, to complete the sale immediately. Franklin, despite his growing dread, was still a businessman. $1,500 was $1,500, and the opportunity to rid himself of Iodell while actually profiting from the transaction was too tempting to refuse. The viewing was scheduled for noon, in that same brick chamber that had witnessed the psychological destruction of multiple men. Hemlock entered alone, dismissing Franklin and the guards with a wave of his hand, wanting no witnesses to what he considered a simple act of establishing dominance. The door closed behind him with a sound like a tomb ceiling. For 11 minutes there was silence. Then came a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. Augustus Hemlock, the man who had terrorized thousands, began to scream. The screaming was not constant but came in waves, punctuated by periods of sobbing and incoherent pleading that sounded like a child begging for mercy from an unmerciful universe. Franklin and the guards rushed to the door, but found it locked from the inside. Impossible, since there was no interior lock mechanism, since the door only secured from the outside. They pounded on the wood, shouting Hemlock's name, demanding he open the door. But the only response was more screaming and the sound of something heavy repeatedly striking the floor. When they finally broke through, splintering the doorframe with an axe, they found a scene that would be discussed in whispers for generations. Hemlock was on his knees in the center of the room, his expensive suit soaked with sweat and tears, his hands bleeding from where he had clawed at the brick walls until his fingernails had torn away. Iodell sat exactly where she had been, motionless, her shackles still secure, her expression utterly calm. She had not moved, she had not touched him. And yet Hemlock was broken in a way that transcended physical damage. He was shattered at the level of soul, reduced to a weeping, incoherent thing that could barely remember its own name. They carried him out of the chamber, and he babbled continuously about debts and ledgers, about faces he had forgotten rising from darkness, about hands reaching for him from soil fertilized with the bodies of those he had worked to death. The town physician was summoned, examined him, and could provide no diagnosis beyond complete mental collapse. Hemlock was transported back to his plantation in a wagon, restrained like a madman, and 3 weeks later he hanged himself in his study, using a rope braided from cotton, the crop that had made his fortune. He left a suicide note written in shaking handwriting that consisted of a single sentence repeated 147 times. "She showed me the sum of what I am." The note was burned by his family, desperate to prevent scandal, but multiple witnesses had read it, and the words spread through the community like infection through an open wound. Isaac Franklin, confronted with the undeniable reality that Iodell could not be sold, could not be safely kept, could not be disposed of through any conventional means, made a decision born of pure desperation. On September 24, 1840, 10 days after her arrival at Natchez, he had her transported under armed guard to the edge of the Mississippi River and told her she was free. There were no manumission papers, no legal documentation, no formal emancipation, just a terrified man opening shackles with trembling hands and telling a woman who had destroyed 6 men without lifting a finger that she could go wherever she wished. Iodell stood on the muddy river bank, rubbing her wrists where the iron had left its permanent marks, and looked at Franklin with an expression that might have been pity, or might have been contempt, or might have been something beyond human emotion entirely. She asked, "You think this ends it?" she asked, her voice quiet beneath the sound of the river's eternal flowing. "You think releasing one woman balances the ledger of 10,000 souls?" Franklin had no answer. He rode away as quickly as his horse could carry him, and he never spoke publicly about Iodel again, though those close to him reported that he aged rapidly in the following years, that he began to drink heavily, that he would wake screaming from nightmares he refused to describe. Iodel disappeared into the landscape of the antebellum South, and here the historical record becomes fragmentary, contradictory, impossible to verify through conventional documentation. Some accounts claim she was seen in Louisiana, working as a root doctor and midwife, helping enslaved women and unwanted pregnancies that resulted from rapes, providing herbs and knowledge that preserved some measure of bodily autonomy in a system designed to strip it away. Other stories place her in Alabama and Georgia and the Carolinas, always moving, always just beyond capture, just always leaving behind slaveholders who went mad or died in improbable accidents. The slave trading community began to develop protocols specifically to avoid her descriptions circulated. Warning signs were established. Jest's entire markets would temporarily close if rumors suggested she was in the region. She had become more than a woman. She had become an idea the cost of cruelty made manifest. The last confirmed sighting of Iodel occurred in 1859. Jest's 1 year before the first shots of the Civil War would shatter the South's peculiar institution and drown the cotton fields in blood that had been owed for generations. An elderly woman matching her description was reported in northern Mississippi, sitting beside a river singing songs in Yoruba that made the air feel heavy with approaching storm. A young slave named Jacob, fleeing north toward uncertain freedom, claimed she gave him directions and a warning: the reckoning is coming. Not justice. Justice would require mercy and balance. Just reckoning. The blood that's been spilled will drown those who spilled it. When the war came, when Sherman's march burned plantations and freed the enslaved, when the Confederacy collapsed under the weight of its own monstrous contradictions, some said they could feel her presence in the smoke, in the fire, in the chaos that dismantled a civilization built on stolen bodies and stolen lives. She was never found, never captured, never confirmed dead. The records simply stop as if she walked out of history and into legend, which is perhaps the only appropriate ending for someone who had transcended the boundaries of individual existence and become myth. Isaac Franklin died in 1846 at age 55, wealthy but haunted. Josiah Tremaine drank himself to death in 1843, raving in his final days about eyes in the darkness. The Natchez slave market continued operations until 1863, when Union forces occupied the city and the forks of the road became a refugee camp for freed people. The brick isolation chamber where Iodel had been held was torn down in 1872, and locals claimed that even the rubble felt wrong, that plants refused to grow on that spot, that animals avoided it instinctively. Today, a historical marker stands near the site, commemorating the forks of the road and its role in the domestic slave trade, but it makes no mention of the woman who became the nightmare that haunted the nightmare, the debt collector who required payment in terror and madness. Her real name? Iodel, meaning joy has come home, is lost to official history, but in the whispered stories of descendants, in the folk tales passed down through generations, she endures the reminder that some souls refuse to be broken, and that cruelty, no matter how systematized or legalized, always carries a cost that eventually comes due. She was not a hero. She was not a savior. Suggests she was the reckoning that walked on two legs, that looked with human eyes, that spoke with a human voice the truth that comfortable societies spend centuries trying to forget. That every system built on suffering will eventually be haunted by what it created, and that some debts can never be forgiven, only witnessed and remembered until the end of time.